Hi everyone, and welcome to Turf Talk Down Under. I'm Angie, and with me today I have Nick Osbaldiston, and he is an academic from Queensland. How are you going, Nick?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good, thank you. I bet you're a bit warmer where you are than we are down here in Melbourne at the moment.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's all relative, isn't it? But
Yeah.
it's about 28 degrees, I think, today. That's actually pretty good.
Oh,
There's a bit of wind
uh,
around, a bit of
it's
rain.
about 11. It's about 11 where I am, and I've got the heater on, so there you go.
I'm
But
not. Yeah.
Melbourne is generally quite frosty towards people like me at the moment anyway. One of the reasons that you wanted to come on this channel is because you wanted to talk about how academics are being bullied in their workplaces around the issue of gender identity, and particularly to talk about how these actions are being directed by students towards staff and the lack of support for staff. Yeah, that's something that I want to sort of flesh out with you, because our local turf queen, Holly Lawford-Smith, has had a stickering and a poster campaign at her university where her classrooms have been labelled with things saying that she's a Nazi, and accusing her students of being Nazis if they attend her feminism class and things like that. And there's other academics. I've been contacted by students of academics who have spoken to us on this show, or who have associated with us by following each other on social media, and they are being threatened with similar campaigns.
Yeah, it's all very unpleasant business, unfortunately. And I think just to give a bit of background, I guess, why this is something that interests me, I guess. First and foremost, I should clarify a couple of things. I don't necessarily consider myself a TERF, which is interesting, but because I don't, one of the reasons why this is kind of important to me is that for a while I always considered, or still do actually, that feminism is both a movement but also an embodied movement in some respects. I don't necessarily have any capacity to really understand what it's like to grow up as a woman, if that makes sense, and to grow up in that kind of patriarchal order. So I always considered myself to just be a feminist ally to a certain extent. I do have question marks around that sort of stuff anyway, but I always thought TERF, like the use of the word TERF, was always such a slur, and it was quite clear that it was from the outset. I think bullying and harassment by against academics has been going on it's been going on for a long time, obviously, and this is something that we have to really be concerned about and question. The first time that I sort of started seeing it happening actually was when I was actually working as a postdoctoral research fellow at University of Melbourne, and actually watching people go after the climate scientists in such a way that the climate scientists were actually having to have security escort them. One of them in particular, I think if I remember rightly, and I could be wrong, had to have their name, their contact details taken down, like where their actually office was, and their phone number and whatnot, because it was too much. And then over time, I've seen political ideological groups, the state, in other words, the government, corporations, and all sorts of other interests try to harass, intimidate, bully, whatever you want to call it, academics in their scholarship, from archaeologists working in different areas all the way through to a friend of mine who's a dingo researcher who often gets attacked by environmentalists and whatnot for various reasons. And so I find it really intriguing, and I've kind of had a long time thinking about what academic freedom actually is and how it entails. But in this particular incident, with the way in which it's been organized, and it stems right back to the UK scholars, from Kathleen through to Joe, through to all the others, you know what I mean? All these people who have basically been targeted. It seems to me that there's a very limited understanding of what academic freedom actually is. And I think that's one of the problems that's associated with this kind of whole discussion around universities. I don't think students really understand what it actually means. And so what I think we get is a case in point of students basically saying, well, we have the power, so we're going to intimidate the university to remove this said person. And I think that was quite clear in Judith Swiss's and Alice Sullivan's policy statement, where they actually do make a statement to suggest that, or a conclusion, I should say, to say that academic freedom ought to be taught as a fundamental thing to all the students that are there. I would actually go a little bit. Sorry, go on.
It was.
Yeah, it was. I don't think it is anymore. And I think that's been an interesting case. But I would go even a little bit further than that. I would say that right back into the schooling system, we actually need to teach students what it means to live in a pluralistic democracy where you're going to have multiple voices and multiple concerns and multiple approaches, especially in a country that is highly multicultural as ours are, and frankly learn how to disagree without actually turning it into a riot, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Wasn't that the reason that, I mean, that was the reason that I went to university, to learn about things that were outside my echo chamber. I grew up in a rural environment and I knew the world was different away from where I lived, and university exposed me to that. And this is the days before the internet, obviously. So I think, and back then university was free, that the government, had sort of like a financial control over what was happening there. And, then when full fee paying students came in and universities sort of became more corporatized and more like companies, there was a shift in what was being taught.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I guess is really important to do is really define what academic freedom is. And at a general level, it's effectively defined in such a way that it's about freedom. It's about freedom of academics. So the definition by the Global Colloquium of University Professors, or Presidents, I should say, that happened in 2005 was to, at its simplest form, academic freedom may be defined as the freedom to conduct research, teach, speak, and publish subject to the norms and standards of scholarly inquiry without interference or penalty, and this is the most important point, wherever the search for truth and understanding may lead. And I actually really like that. And it's surely it is a little bit kind of metaphysical, like where's the truth and that sort of other stuff. And we could have a discussion and debate about what truth is.
But that's why they're targeting philosophers, because that's such a broad area of study. So they're a soft target, really.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think in philosophy in particular, there's such disagreement on different aspects. It should be the place, it actually should be the one place where freedom of discussion and inquiry is the most open, if you will. But evidently not necessarily the case with Holly. So one of the things that I guess I think is really important about academic freedom is the responsibility of universities. And in this particular document, what it actually makes a point about is that the rights of the scholars and students should be that they should be able to do what they do, study, research, plan, learn, without fear of intimidation or reprisal, free from political interference in an environment of tolerance for and engagement with divergent opinions. It then says there's a responsibility on scholars to make sure that they have classrooms which allow for freedom of inquiry and freedom of discussion. And then it says that the university has a heavy responsibility to make sure that scholars and students who work within them are free from improper pressures, whether political, cultural, economic, or ideological. And that in particular, they need to protect all members of academic staff and student against external and internal influences that might restrict the exercise of freedoms. And I think that's exactly what they're not doing, right? I could be wrong. I mean, I think that what the University of Melbourne has done, by all accounts, has actually protected and advocated that academic freedom is definitely a thing that they support. They've supported Holly in the past. Whether or not they support her in this particular campaign, I don't know, but it's been quite targeted, not only towards her, but also the students that take her subjects. And when you do that, I think you lose academic freedom. I kind of a bit cynical about academic freedom. I think it's kind of on its last threads, so to speak. And this is kind of our last stand, so to speak. But when you bend to the will of a noisy and quite targeted harassment in that respect, you have I think you stifle that quest for truth, that classroom environment where you can actually have open discussions about things that are quite deeply important, but also really need to be teased out in an environment where you can encourage debate, but then also encourage the right for people to make up their minds about different things quite clearly. I can't imagine what the impact of those sorts of posters are on students who take that subject. I can imagine it has a chilling effect on them.
Yeah. It was scary enough to walk into a feminist subject back when I was at university in the 90s. You know, because you were labelled as a man-hating, hairy-legged, whatever.
Right.
So it was intimidating enough to take a subject like that. And you know, I can only imagine what it's like to be called a Nazi, particularly like you said. You know, a lot of students are from different cultures, and they're interested in Western concepts of feminism, which are very different from their own culture. So, you know, that would be a really interesting subject to take. And imagine walking to your tute and seeing this sign there that says, if you take this subject, you're a Nazi. I mean, one, it's ridiculous. But when you're young and you're impressionable, it's also scary. And we've all seen the hostility that trans rights activists have towards anyone that they perceive to be transphobic. It would be quite frightening. You would really be watching your back on campus.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about what that actually means and how that actually goes about. I think what's really important about that is the question of when these sorts of slurs, you might want to call it, but we might call it something like the act of the shaming exercise, especially against women, and what that actually does, and the historical legitimacy, or not legitimacy, the historical relevance to all of this is quite clear. But the thing that I guess I'd point out a little bit further is that this isn't just the gender issue either. This is across a whole range of different issues that the students would need to kind of, I guess, check their inquiry. There's a lot of discussion around this sort of issue. There's a couple of academics out there who are working on how do we actually engender in a classroom environment the idea that there is a safe I hate the word safe space, but this is a safe space for you to explore different ideas, right? Without kind of fear of like, this is going to get out and you're going to be suddenly targeted as this sort of horrible person. What I do and what a number of other people do is make a point at the beginning of any class, especially if it's a class that happens to deal with some touchy subjects, is just say, look, don't assume everyone here is left wing. And that's the first point, right? We have to respect that there's going to be diversity of opinion. And if you look at election results, there is a diversity of opinion in this country. Respect one another's opinions, recognize that the way that we deal with argument is through evidence in particular, and not just ad hominem attacks, not just labeling, stereotyping, stigmatizing people, not using lazy labels as well. Like, for instance, oh, you're just a white person, you don't know what you're talking about. And I think that that's one of the worst, actually, that I've seen more recent times. And that's me as a person of color, I guess you could say, saying that. But I think we really need to kind of step back in the classroom in particular and actually make a bit more of a stand to say this is actually free exploration of ideas right now, especially in the social sciences and humanities. Obviously, you can't do that so much in like dentistry or like, you know, things like that, where it's like, no, this is teeth and you have to learn how to fix teeth. But in humanities and social sciences, in education to a certain extent, and various other places, there has to be that freedom of exploration of ideas. Otherwise, yeah, we're just basically churning out, we're just become jobademia in some ways, effectively.
Well, Isn't that part of the problem, that some of the people that are perpetuating these sort of ideological perspectives in universities, they're career academics, like they move from students into academia and keep perpetuating it. And so they've created like a situation where the only jobs that the people who perpetuate these ideologies are able to have is in further perpetuating the ideology. So, you know, the university then becomes the breeding ground for the academics that perpetuate the ideology, and it just keeps going and going and going. But I think what they're going to find is there's going to be so many trans-identified kids taking gender studies that they're going to have an oversupply, and they're all going to end up on the dole queue. So, you know,
well, there's a
universities, yeah, well, you know, universities are playing a huge role in that. Like every trans-identified young person I know is in either going into academia. Their aim is to teach gender studies, or is to be a social worker, which always sort of irks me a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know the trends of data there. That'd be really interesting to have a look at, actually, though. But I think what I sort of noticed is that's a wider issue, really, about young people going through university degrees anyway, and then going on to do their PhDs, and then entering into a very limited job market in academia. And it is very limited. There's so very little jobs now within the space of academia, especially in the social sciences and humanities. So, I mean, that's another discussion to be had. But yeah, I haven't actually tracked any of that sort of data. It'd be quite interesting to see where those sort of gender studies people end up when they graduate, where they go from there.
Well, they have a kind of like a celebrity status, you know, as authorities on gender studies. So it's very appealing to young people to want to become an expert in gender studies.
Like I don't have a lot of understanding of what they teach in gender studies. I do have a fairly good understanding of what queer theory is and various other things like that, especially Judith Butler's work. But yeah, it'd be quite interesting to see what the graduate outcomes of people who major in gender studies is. I'm not sure what that data is. We wouldn't have that data with the Australian Graduate Outcome Survey, but it'd be quite intriguing.
But yeah, we didn't graduate in feminism back in the day. You know, feminism was a little side subject to psychology, sociology, and other sort of arts units. You didn't actually get a degree in feminism, so because you would be unemployable, particularly where I studied. So
yeah, I mean, they had majors in women's studies, you know, around, but those are all. I'm just trying to think. Pretty much sure that most of those have all disappeared now, and all blended into gender studies.
People went and worked in domestic violence and things like that. You know, places where an understanding of women's sex-based oppression was important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now that it's all family violence and degendered and desexed, you know, it doesn't seem to be as important to understand like the philosophical side of feminism and how women got to be in the position that they're in, and how these social things impact on women and cause these social contagions like family violence. And yeah,
I don't know. I don't teach in that area. I've never taught in that area, but it'd be quite interesting to see the values that come out. I mean, most of the time, the people that I see going into those sorts of positions now are social workers anyway. So they tend to kind of have a very different way of learning about the world now than maybe what they did in the 1990s, I guess.
Yeah.
Very social justice orientated type approach, which they always had in the 1990s, but obviously aligned much more with what. This is why in social work here they used to actually have a women's studies major along with it, so that would actually become, you know, so you could work in the domestic violence centers or the rape crisis centers and whatnot. Yeah, so I guess going right back, circling back to the question of that chilling effect that has on students, it also it clearly has a chilling effect on academics themselves, right? So what I note, I've been following this space since, I want to say 2012, 2013. when I sort of saw there was a conference of ex-sex workers who were leaving the industry and collecting themselves to come together and have a conference about what their experience was like, to launch a book that was co-edited by some academics at RMIT. And just the loud and horrific lobbying to kind of get that canned, and
I
then
remember that.
yeah, attacking some of the academics involved was really actually quite astounding to me.
And attacking the exited women, like women who were there speaking about their trauma and shouting over them and abusing them. Horrific.
Yeah, and there was one incident where I can't remember the name of the woman. She's a social worker, but she talks about child sex work, sex exploitation and stuff. And she was in the event. She was, I don't know if it was that event or another one, but she was giving a lecture, and they just busted in because she had been associated with a couple of other events where they were talking about exited programs for sex workers. And just, yeah, they were just shouting at her, and she was like, I'm here to talk about child sex exploitation. Like, this is nothing to do. And yeah, it just reminded me, I guess, of the perilous situation that is a couple of the areas of research that are around, that are mostly predominantly women who are researching in them, who often predominantly are the ones copying all the flack.
Yeah.
And just after that, just watching, especially overseas, starting with Selena Todd, starting with a few other women who were starting to get disinvited, counter-platformed, and then obviously moving into the kind of more horrendous case of Kathleen Stock. And then also the cases in the US, right, with a couple of the people over there who were attacked and vilified for their views on sex and gender. It's just really troubling to a large extent, to the point now where it's gotten, especially with Kathleen, but now with Holly, to the point where it's just horrific language that is so hyperbolic and just quite profoundly lying in a way to kind of discredit her and her as an academic, frankly, and her as a scholar in her place.
And her as a person, as a human being.
Yeah, and that's something that I want to kind of talk about, because I think the thing that really got me quite cranky, and I get cranky a lot, let's just say, I'm an old 46 or whatever, 45-year-old man who yells at the television a lot, and as a father, that's my right, I think. But when the Let Women Speak event, was Let Women Speak, was that what it was called? I think I think I called it something else wrong the other day. When it happened so it started in up here, right, and then it went sorry, not here in Cairns, but in Brisbane, and you sort of had very limited media coverage about it. There was hardly anything, honestly. And then you kind of got down to Adelaide, where it started. Adelaide was next, wasn't it? And it got a little bit heated, but we always knew that the Melbourne one was going to be a problem. And it's not to stereotype Melbourne, but it is the heartland. It is the heartland of a lot of
Nazis. There's lots of Nazis in Melbourne, and then not women.
A lot of the progressive ideology as well, if you want to call it progressive. It's not progressive. In fact, progressivism is completely different, and people misunderstand that. But and as soon as those Nazis turned up, I knew that was going to be it. You were going to be associated with Nazis. You were going to be associated with fascists, and there were three things that happened on that moment. One, it was quite clear that you weren't associated with them at all, because the leader of the bloody thing turned around and said we denounce Kelly Jane and all those women there who were like, what did they call you?
They said we were converting women to lesbianism.
Yeah, radical lesbians who are going to destroy the planet.
Yay.
not to mention that there were Jewish women in that congregation as well. So it's not like they were friends. The second one that I saw was well, and the other thing is that just the constant like why didn't you? So what's the slogan now? You stood with fascists.
It's changed because it was you are a fascist, but
Yeah,
because of us bleating on social media saying that's preposterous, you
right.
morons, prove it. It's now well, you're willing to stand with fascists,
Yes. Well, yeah, the
which
thing
we
that I got
weren't.
told was, why didn't the women go up and confront them? Which why are you telling women to go up and confront a bunch of very angry men in that circumstance? The police should have done it, frankly.
Yeah. Well, I
Uh,
went to the police and said, "What the heck?" Because when I was told who they were after
yeah.
they'd done their little stunt, said, "Get them hell away from us." You know, you
Mm,
realise what this is going to do.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so, uh, any idea that the women were had to go and actually, I don't know what did they want? I guess what they wanted you to do is like pack up and leave then, right? Well, no, this was an opportunity for you to gather. And the other thing I say is this wasn't a protest. This was a gathering of women to talk and to share and collectively experience that kind of moment of being together and allies, of course, as well. Um, and but once they turned up, that was it. The label was now made available, right? And so old school social interactionist 101, Irving Goffman, Harold Garfinkel, all those sorts of guys from the symbolic interactionist Chicago school would say the next step in that would be the kind of shaming exercises that would then go on. And what we saw is the kind of political class step in. That was the second thing. And I will be honest, I will be open about this. Daniel Andrews and Adam Bant were the first to jump on this and basically throw all those women, having not actually even engaged with the content of the talks that were in those,
That was
right,
deliberate.
and
They
engage with
actually,
the. Oh yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. There's no
He
question.
deliberately said, "We're not going to speak or show these people because they are to be condemned." And he wasn't just referring to the Nazis, he was referring to the women's group. He
Yeah,
was urging people not to like go and see what we're all about, because this whole lie depends on people not knowing what we're all about.
and there's been a doubling down of that in more recent times by Adam Bant in relation to Kath Dees, but we'll come back to that if you like. But what it leads to is as a public, a ritualistic public shaming that isn't necessarily like. I kind of draw comparisons to. I don't know if you remember the stories of when D-Day happened and liberation of France happened, and they grabbed all of the women that
Yes.
they thought were associated with being Nazi sympathizers, or they were sex workers who had been working and help with German soldiers and French soldiers, and just publicly grabbing them, shaving their heads in public, and then parading them through the streets. Um, and in a sense, what I saw here was not suggesting that that's what they were doing in the political class, but what they were effectively doing was the same thing. They were grabbing you as women, labeling you with this particular term, which was it's very horrific. It's completely incorrect. A, you're not Nazis. B, you're definitely not fascists. And I wouldn't be talking to you as if it was the case. Um, and not to neglect, not to mention that also yourself and other women within the group actually have Jewish ancestry, so it's quite
Yeah.
offensive to suggest that.
And there was famous like feminist authors in
Yes.
our audience, like world famous feminist authors. There were academics, there were members of the Greens. There were so many women who
Diversity of
are
women,
the
yeah.
complete opposite of Nazis.
Oh,
And he
fantastic.
knew that. Everyone knew that.
Well, yeah, he did do that. Oh, well, I mean, I assume he knew that. Who knows? But then John Pizzuto jumped on it, and we have the situation with Maura Deeming, obviously. But the thing that's
Repeat
different
behind
about,
me.
yeah, I mean,
Yes.
the thing that I find is different about this then past exercises of shaming women publicly that goes right back into history with the suffragettes, with everyone, is that we are not in the same environment anymore. We're in an online public shaming ritual where that once you label a woman as a Nazi or fascist, you can then keep that label on her, and you can keep that shaming on her forever. I mean, look
It's
what
true.
they do with J.K. Rowling. They don't
My
necessarily engage ever with J.K. Rowling's essay or anything like that, but once she's attracted the label of, well, I mean, some of them have been calling her a fascist or a bigot or a transphobe or whatever it is. That's it. It sticks, and no one will ever engage with her again. And so what it does is actually makes people below human.
Yes.
And you're not meaningful to the community anymore.
And my inbox represents that. The way that my inbox is full of cries for me to kill myself or, threats of assault with soup mostly. But, we are seen as less than human. And my children will go, unless one of these prominent politicians comes out and actually retracts what he said and apologises, my children will Google me in 20 to 30 years' time, and it will come up that mum was a Nazi. Which on one hand I find hilarious because it's so absolutely ridiculous. And on the other hand, I'm absolutely horrified.
So I absolutely agree with you. And I hope that isn't the case, because I do hope that sense comes around and we actually start to disentangle all of this nonsense and these labeling exercises. I just want to read you something that comes from a paper that's written by Guy Aitchison and Saladin Mekel Garcia. It was written in 2021, actually. It's about mass online public shaming and the ethical problems with it. And this is what it says. It says, categorizing someone as not worthy of membership in moral society can also mean that the shamed person is open to a number of other actions as a legitimate target. These can add to the stigma, as with the use of abuse, and add to the sense of being cast out of moral society, as where attempts to ensue to affect the person's social relations, such as their employment or membership of associations, the use of insults such as idiot, loser, bastard, bigot, Nazi, fascist, generally has the aim of hurting, offending, and humiliating another, but also then can obviously lead to dramatic consequences, is what we saw in Auckland. Right? So once it sticks, and once that label sticks, you become open to a number of other actions as now a legitimate target. And what we saw with the violence in Auckland was quite evident of that.
See, we would have survived being called Nazis if the Nazis had shown up even, because it would have been the trans rights activists and the anti-fascists saying it. It is the fact that politicians came and accused us of the same thing that has made the poo stick, if you'd like to put it that way. Because I've been called a bigot and a Nazi and a fascist for years. As soon as I spoke out and said men are not women and never can be, it's a ludicrous thing to expect women to accept that men are women because they say they are. Ever since I came out and said that, I've been called all of those names. So, and even the Nazis showing up, there's a reason they showed up. It's because the anti-fascists challenged them to be there. So it's, the fact we would have been called Nazis, and people would have said, oh, the Nazis were there, so you're Nazis. And we would have said, that's ridiculous. But it's when the media aided people like Andrews, Bant and Pizzuto by only saying the lies that they told and doubling down on them. Like, I was not just defamed once by John Pizzuto based on an out of context tweet that had multiple meanings that didn't obviously demonstrate that I was a Nazi. He used that particular tweet to justify sacking Maura Denning, which was absolutely ridiculous. But the fact that he sat there while the ABC and 3AW and a whole bunch of other people said my name and said that I, as the organizer, had strong links to the National Socialists, it's like, that is an absolute and utter lie. And they got away with it. And Pizzuto's sitting there nodding his head. He could have said, oh, no, it's been clarified to me that I made a mistake and that woman doesn't have links to Nazis, but nobody's ever done that. And like you said, the fact that we know, I mean, I'm not a cancelled woman because I have this platform. But, you know, the mainstream media will message my inbox and ask me for other people's details, but they won't acknowledge me. They'll use information I've given them, but they won't acknowledge me publicly because I'm a marked woman. I am cancelled. And, you know, they think I'm a baddie, but they're quite willing to use the information I dredge up for them. You know, they've sort of run with that, and they won't platform any of us to tell the truth. They won't platform any of the women that spoke. So they can say, oh, look, we're not going to have Kelly J, and we're not going to have Angela, and we're not going to have, you know, a whole bunch of people because they're bad. But there was women who shared at that event who they could have spoken to. And they haven't platformed one person. They've showed no footage of our event apart from Kelly J at the microphone. You know, they've completely and utterly like covered us over, and we've had zero right of reply apart from, you know, sort of right-leaning or conspiracy theorist podcasts usually, or our own platforms. And, you know, our platforms are being targeted too. Like, they're trying to take down this YouTube channel. They're trying to take down my Patreon. Like, they're a constant barrage of keeping us silent because they're so afraid of us speaking up and telling the truth, and people going, oh, hang on, these women have a point. They're terrified of it. And that's why Andrews did it. And the thing was that people that I would not have expected to be woken up by that have contacted me and go, you're not a Nazi. What the hell's going on? Why did he say that? Like, it's woken up a whole bunch of moderate people who were just being nice. And it's also got people, like particularly within the Greens and places like that, who were already sort of thinking, geez, I need to speak out on this, but I'm not willing to do it. And they've just seen what he's done, that he's completely misrepresented women with valid concerns, and they've lost their shit and said, stuff it, I'm going full turf. So it's had the opposite of effect of what he's intended, but it still has caused unspeakable harm to a whole lot of people, myself included. I don't have Moira and Kelly J's resources to fight back. All I have is my Twitter and this. And, you know, I think the women who support me and support Moira, and, you know, the women, and men and women who have stood up for us and said they're not Nazis, that's ridiculous, look at their history, look at this. You know, I can't thank them enough, because without them, I don't know where I would be today, because it is horrific to be the most hated woman in the state based on the false information of powerful men, and to have your life and your family's lives threatened. It is a horrific place to be in for days and weeks. And if it wasn't for all those wonderful people sticking up for us, you know, yeah, so thank you. I think people have managed to turn the narrative around just with refusing to accept this preposterous idea that women are Nazis.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope that people really do appreciate that that is just a hyperbolic statement. And I think, just going back to your point, so I think that a lot of people will say, well, you're not cancelled, or you're not silenced because obviously you have a platform or whatever else, and yada, yada, yada. But the reality is that in that situation, or in any of the situations that we talk about in this stuff, there's only one very small section of the media that wants to report on it. I find it, I mean, the stuff that happened with The Guardian with, what's the name of the journalist that had to quit? Oh, can't remember off the top of my head. But, you know, when The Guardian had a whole bunch of, an open letter that was signed by a whole bunch of journalists, basically saying we need to have transphobia removed from our platform, etc., etc. I'm like, well, you're journalists, you're supposed to actually be sitting down and even the most uncomfortable things you've got to still like go through, and you've still got to understand. Otherwise, we would never understand half the stuff that's going on in the world. We would just be like reporting on one side of the political divide. I mean, this is something that, you know, Hannah Arendt talks about in her work, about the idea that you can't understand the world from one perspective, because the world is such a complicated place. You've got to see things from multiple perspectives, and you've got to come together and reason. You've got to rationalize and think about, I mean, I think with this particular issue, right, like when it started kicking off the most, I reckon it started really kicking off around 2010, this kind of gender identity stuff, and the conflict of rights, if you will, between women and trans people. I mean, it's clear that at that point, if we had reasonable people who are politically inclined or in political class say, okay, we can sit down and we can have a conversation about this. Let's talk about how we can actually move forward together. But they ignored it for so long, and then all of a sudden they just jumped ship and turned on the diversity, inclusion, and hats, and then they just decided to incorporate whatever the organisations that are involved, like Stonewall and whatnot, and ACON here, I suppose, in Australia, to the point now where you've got, I think I saw the statement this morning from Nina Vallen's leak, the 9-point changes that the Greens want to put into case about what transphobia actually is. And honestly, it's quite frightening, I think, to see what some of the ideas of transphobia. I mean, I've asked people before, so we're going way off topic, sorry, but I've asked people before to define to me what transphobia is, especially in the context of the university environment. And I don't get great responses.
No.
You know, and words matter. Like, they've got to mean. They've got to be a signifier and a signified. And one person just said to me, "Transphobia is transphobia." That was the definition. The other definition that I got was, I know transphobia when I see it, just like I know that it's a chair when I see a chair. And I just kind of think, wow, that's crazy. Like, if you can't define something properly, then we're kind of lost in some respects. But what we've got now is a case in the Greens where they're actually trying to define it really properly, and it's so limiting to a political party that used to actually be very high on the concept of free speech. Not so much anymore.
It just doesn't make sense that they're shilling for Big Pharma too. You know, the Greens have lost their way. It's social justice, and in this capacity and the environment are in direct contrast.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right interesting. I mean, it's a good case in point of when a single issue political party decides to broaden out and incorporate a whole range of different issues, then they start to really lose their traction with the public in some ways. I noted that they didn't go up in the last New South Wales election, despite the fact that climate change remains. I mean, I could be wrong there. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not sure, but climate change remains such a major issue, and what we don't need is, we need action now, and what we don't need is constant discussions around stuff like this, because it just doesn't do anything. Like, it gets in the way of that action in a lot of ways, I think.
And also that they're kicking women out of the Greens while they're allowing people with quite clearly disturbing personal histories and disturbing personal views to stay in. And part of some of those people have a trans identity, and it's like they're too afraid to sort of them out. It's just the hypocrisy is astonishing. You know, you can be kicked out of the Greens for saying, I don't believe men are women, but you can, you know, support Nazis, pedophiles, and, you know, all sorts of other disgusting things, and remain in the Greens.
Yeah, I mean, that brings to, I guess, a nice sort of point, a segue into organisation, like the way that organisations govern what gets defined as transphobia, I guess you could say. I think it was really telling in Judith and Alice's report that they did. I'll see if I can find it, where they actually kind of outline the sort of things that have led, and they've empirically linked to people being labelled as transphobic. And some of it's just like, if you tell this to an ordinary person, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But it's just things like, if someone said something to the effect of, here it is here, statements like this that get denounced as transphobic, and this is within the academy, more or less. All mammals have two sexes, male and female. Females are the sex that produce the large immobile gametes called ova. Males are the ones that produce small gametes called sperm. Women are adult human females. Women do not have penises. Homosexuality, same-sex attracted. only women have cervixes, that trans women who transitions to adult has not always been female, that non-gender conforming young children should not be encouraged to believe they may have been born in the wrong body and that they can change their sex. Now, these sorts of statements are not controversial.
No.
And they ought to be, especially within the academy, things that we can discuss. And sure, if we want to debate them, let's debate them. But let's do it
evidence-based.
Let's do it in an honest and open fashion, and not in a way that if you even consider being or arguing some of these points, then all of a sudden then you're a transphobe, and and then all the stigmas apply, right? And then it goes from transphobe to TERF to Nazi to fascist. And I find that just absolutely, I find it quite depressing, actually, to be honest. Especially when it's, and I've always maintained this from day one. I have personal opinions about all this stuff that I don't know that's actually a man's place to say some of these things, to be honest with you. This is a women's issue fundamentally. But I do have a problem with the idea that women should be made to shut up and just accept that these things should not be debated. I love that there's no debate argument, which is absolute nonsense. And that women just have to sit down and take it, right? And that they can't have an opinion about their own spaces, their own sport, their own rape crisis centers, all these different things that are just, or their own awards even, like all these different things that have been established. And people say, well, it's been long established. No, it hasn't been long established. In the history of the world, women's rights is a very, very new phenomena. And I just find it just absolutely appalling in some respects that you've got situations like yours where you've been defined in such a way that you're now less than human. You've got lesbian academics like Holly Lawford Smith being told that they're fascists, which is absolutely crazy.
It is.
Other ones like Kathleen Stock was the same, another lesbian academic. Women who have been fighting for years for women's rights to space and all sorts of other things are being called like all sorts of horrible names and things. It's just like, what the hell's gone wrong? What's happened? But yeah, so that's my view. I just think that this is a kind of situation upon which reasonable people, especially within the political class, but also within organizations, need to say, no, this actually needs to be something that we can have a rational discussion about.
I've always said that, because we're in a state that's had self-ID for a couple of years now, and I can't leave my house without seeing a trans-identified person. It's not, there's this misconception that we're still talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of people, and people just go along with trans rights because they think, well, it'll never affect me. It won't be in my change room. It won't be in my sports team. It doesn't affect us. And it's only when it impacts on them in real life that they go, holy shit, this really does impact on us or women or whatever. And then they wake up. So yeah, that's why Victoria is such a hotbed of hate at the moment, because people are starting to wake up. It's not a tiny minority anymore. It's like a lot of men insisting on being women in every sense of the word. There's no escape. But at the same time, we're in this position where the state government is legislating away single-sex services. So now there's, all of the public toilets are being replaced with unisex. All the hospital wards are unisex. For the public hospitals, of course, not private hospitals, they're still sex specific. Mental health wards, unisex. And now all those, places where we thought were the safe places like rape crisis, domestic violence services are now unisex. So if you're a woman who's experienced family violence, and you want to go to a refuge and there's no beds at a specific refuge, well, one, you can be in a refuge and there'll be a trans-identifying male there. But two, if you're put in a hotel with your family because there's nowhere else for you to go, you might have a man who's just out of jail in the next hotel room. Like, there's no place where you can go and just be away from men. There's nowhere in this state. anymore. And that's why we're all going underground. That's why we've gone back to what it was like in the 70s, and we're creating our own spaces. And it's, you know, and on a need to know basis, someone says, oh, I know someone who needs somewhere to stay, and someone puts their hand up and says, well, a friend of mine, and we're, you know, secretly creating networks to support women, you know. And for someone who grew up in a time where you know, women's services. My mum stayed in a miserable marriage, you know, because there's nowhere for her to go. You know, dad wasn't abusive, but, you know, she stayed in an unhappy situation because there was no resources there. For someone who's lived through that and then seen resources become available, and now to have them snatched away, it's horrific. It's like, how is this happening? We worked so hard. You know, the women 10, 20 years older than me worked so hard to build these resources. And it's not like the reasons that women need them have gone away, because, you know, rapes are through the roof. Domestic violence is through the roof. You know, all of these things the crime statistics are through the roof. And the number of perpetrators being prosecuted are going down, and the crimes are going up. So the demand is greater than ever, and this is when all these services have been ripped away, you know, when there's a housing crisis. So even, you know, people that aren't in severe hardship can't find anywhere to live, and they're living in their cars. You know, women are staying in awful situations, as are possibly some men, but mostly women with children are staying in horrific situations because there's nowhere for them to go. And if she's desperate enough to actually be eligible for one of these services, she's going to be placed in next to a man. So she stays home, you know. And this is the thing, the women self-excluding. People are like, oh, well, you know, too bad. And it's like, you're not going to realize the impact of this, because women will self-exclude. They will just stay back. And so there'll be no statistics that reflect the amount of women who went to a service and then turned around and walked away because they couldn't get away from men, and they're terrified of men for whatever reason. Right? And, you know, and people have no empathy for those women. They say, oh, you know, she's got to get over her fear of men.
Yeah, I've sort of seen this so many times now, unfortunately, where you do question some of these things and you say, I mean, a case in point was the, what was the name of the swing bath in Sydney that got closed or got?
Oh, MacGyver's pool.
Yeah, so the MacGyver pool, right? So I was having a discussion with someone online about this, and said, okay, well, this is a pool that also gets used by a lot of Islamic women who can't, you know, be in the same pool with men. What do you say to them when their rights to religious, or their religious freedom is in conflict with this rights, right? And I just got told, well, that doesn't matter because trans women are women.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, but not to them, they're not. So, you know, this is a really interesting, fascinating kind of discussion to be had. It certainly is one where we do need to have more nuance, and unfortunately, the nuance is gone immediately as soon as someone makes these kind of slogans: trans women and women, you're a transphobe, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi, blah 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 blah. Because then you just strip away any the playing field goes from here to all of a sudden we're over here, and you're having to defend yourself as, I'm not a Nazi, I'm not a fascist.
I don't even defend it anymore. I just say that's ridiculous.
Or I'm not a trans, I'm not a bigot, etc., etc. Where the playing field should be back here. Like, okay, we've got this pool, we've got refugee women, or maybe not refugee women, but certainly women who have immigrated, who are Islam. We want to have tolerance and respect for multiculturalism, but you can't have that discussion because it's just like, oh no, trans women are women. And the kind of repeated mantra over and over and over again doesn't allow for a proper and thorough consideration and discussion around these issues when two areas of rights collide.
See, they can't discuss it though, because there's no proof. Like I say to them, well, I'm a woman. Explain to me how a man deciding he's a woman makes him a woman.
Right.
And nobody can answer that question. They just say, double down, trans women are women. And it's like, Well, no, explain that. Can you explain it to me as a woman? And nobody can explain. So the only reason this ideology has gotten as far as it has is because they've completely removed any right for us to just tell the truth or to challenge it in any way. Do you actually think it's like that the people that do this, do you think it's like a cult? Like, do you think, because I was talking to someone this morning and they were saying, I can't believe that reasonable, rational people just go along with this thing. And I said, well, I think they make a conscious choice. Apart from children who are groomed into this ideology and learn the mantras and it becomes sort of part of their thinking, except for children and young people who are caught when they're vulnerable, and it sort of infects their thinking and they genuinely believe it, and that's why they want to have the surgeries and things, because they genuinely believe that all these procedures will turn you into the opposite sex. I think adults, politicians who 10 years ago would have said that's ridiculous, who now, you know, like Dan Andrews, are just 100% behind it. I think they make a conscious decision to lie.
That's a really interesting kind of thing to think about, actually. I mean, I don't know. It certainly has all the hallmarks of what we would kind of classify as a kind of a religious tenet, if you will. It's got the religious tenets to it, right? If you want to look at it from the perspective of what I do in cultural sociology, where we look at different things and we sort of say, well, religion has these fundamental building blocks to it, right? That comes out of someone called Emile Durkheim, who wrote about this stuff in the 1910s, and then some of his students kept writing about it, like Marcel Mauss and Robert Ertz and various others. That the fundamental building block of a religion is, for want of a better word, this is what they frame: sacred and profane. So in the sacred, you have all these items and objects and things that are considered to be so holy almost, and almost sayings can actually become that they have to be protected by all costs and sort of kept in glass cages. And you know, this is why they kind of, you know, you see this in the Catholic Church, you see it in any church realistically. They've got their sacred symbols and signs and various other things. What Durkheim basically argued is that this extends out to culture more generally speaking, and you can, the one that the thing that I use for students to kind of latch hold upon is the way in which that the nation state is orientated. Well, in some respects, sometimes the nation state is orientated almost as a kind of quasi-religion, because it's got its sacred emblem, the flag, and it's got its sacred things that they keep in glass cages and stuff like that in museums and the War Memorial in Canberra and things like that. And those things have to be protected at all costs from the profane, right? So that's why in America, burning the American flag is such a problem. You know what I mean? And in essence, I guess what we would say in cultural sociology is that this extends out to all sorts of groups, all sorts of identity groups, who have that kind of fundamental sacred and profane thing going on. But it's certainly evident in this case, where you do have a sacred flag, you have sacred sayings that have to be kept, and if you try to contradict those, then you become almost a heretic and you have to be excluded off and sent off into the wilderness, so to speak. Do you know what I mean? So I think from that perspective, it certainly is. I don't know. I guess the point here is that this happens to be across all sort of parts of culture, right? You could even say that a football team has the same mentality. But this one in particular has ramifications for people's livelihoods and people's experiences, and enforces as I said before, a chilling effect on speech. I mean, you talk about the fact that you're not cancelled, you talk about the fact that other people are not cancelled, but when you see that the way people get treated and called all these names and get piled on and all sorts of other things, it's going to have a chilling effect on your desire to speak. And this is what happens in academia, honestly. This is
I'm scared. I'm scared for my physical safety. If I'm in the city and a group of these people see me, I'm fair game, because they will get credibility within their social circle for punching a turf.
Oh,
So
yeah,
I've lived in Melbourne for over 30 years, and I've never felt uncomfortable walking around the city, even in the evening, you know, and now since that event, I'm watching my back.
Yeah, see, this is where we go back to
Yeah.
the point that was being made by Michael Garcia and Aitchison, that once you make something like that stick, you do become fair game.
Mm.
And the whole the only good Nazi is a dead Nazi, or the only punch a Nazi today, or something to that effect.
Follow your leader. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've got a lot of
so
follow your leader.
once you become a Nazi, you're fair game. But the
Mm.
reality is, you're not a Nazi. You're not a fascist. I don't know how many times I have to keep saying this to people before they actually start believing me. And then it's got to the stage where they're willing to stand with them. Well, they're not willing to stand with them because those Nazis don't like them anyway.
And
So, no.
if you ask them to look at the evidence, the only evidence they had that women and Nazis are the same thing are pictures of Nazis. There's no women in those pictures.
Yeah.
I've seen one image shared that showed the Nazis on the other side of a big concrete bollard and all of us with our backs to them. And they didn't publish that. That was on Maura Deeming's Twitter. They didn't publish it because it showed that the two groups were completely separate, and there was no way those women could have seen what those Nazis were doing. Now, nobody was surprised that they turned up because the anti-fascists challenged them to turn up. But if Daniel Andrews hadn't waded in, and Adam Bandt and John Pesutto hadn't seen an opportunity to silence dissenters, people that, you know, could expose what they're doing to children and how they're using a vulnerable cohort of people with, you know, significant mental illnesses and monetizing them and pretending that they're, you know, being inclusive, when what they're actually doing is enforcing economic rationalism in all these institutions to the detriment of women. You know, they're so desperate because they can see the UK people are starting to wake up. They can see in the US that they're starting to wake up. And Daniel Andrews thought, right, we can use this opportunity to silence these women. Now, anyone with half a brain could see that that's what's happening, because they provided no evidence of us being any way affiliated with the Nazis.
I mean, some of the issues that get raised, especially around the medicalization of children, I would have thought is not controversial to actually question.
No.
Given that our history, especially in critical left inquiry, has been, as you point out, critiquing the medical model and critiquing the biomedical industry in particular. So I'm not sure. It's a strange idea. It really is. It's a strange world that we live in, where the left is now defending the medical model.
Yeah, and also that most of the kids that are targeted by that model are same-sex attracted, that they can't see the inherent homophobia in it of, you know, medicalizing kids who would otherwise turn out gay.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that troubles me a little bit is some of the revelations around comorbidities around this stuff, and the more evidence that's kind of accumulated. There was a paper that was published by, I can't remember the journal, but a bunch of psychologists who had done a systematic review on this and actually found that there quite clearly is some evidence of comorbidities here that hasn't been dealt with. I mean, that the book that's come out by I'm having a bad day with names. The journalist from the BBC who
Hannah Barnes.
Yes, so the book about that, about the Tavistock and the way, and the gender clinics over there, the way they behaved, gives me some hope in that there is opportunities for us to actually move forward in this space with some reason. And I think
it's going to take people with courage.
Yeah, and I think the UK may actually start to turn a corner there with that. The US, on the other hand, the US is just such a cesspool when it comes to politics. It really is.
It is.
I get really fearful for people over there, the way that the far right has now gotten hold of this and has now turned this into this is different ball game over there now, and it really is. And then I guess what you'll see is people will blame people like you and me for that. They'll say, well, you emboldened them to take this stand against trans people. And I'm like, they were going to anyway. The more and more that you kind of made this an issue, and the more that you kept pushing into female spaces and stuff, inevitably the far right was going to intervene, because that's just the nature of how they perform.
I've been speaking out about this issue in my own name since 2014, when my father-in-law transitioned, and I thought, hang on, he's not trans because he's not gay.
Right.
And so I've been speaking out about it, and I got kicked out of the left around 2018. Now, I went on Sky News in 2022. Right. So I'd been waiting all those years for the left to platform women like me who had grave concerns about this ideology. I waited and waited and waited. And the women who from the left who, had a platform wouldn't platform someone like me because I'm nobody and I don't have academic credentials in their mind. And, I felt desperate, and I felt that someone needed to speak out on this issue, someone who was like normal, which I am. I'm just a normal mum. And so we did this YouTube channel, and then we, built a profile from doing this YouTube channel. But I waited and waited and waited for so long for my fellow lefties to speak out on this issue. And the only people that would platform us were Christians or conservatives. And I've tried to keep a firm line in who I will work with. But, you can only go for so long at being silenced and abused and ridiculed and defamed and defrauded before you will go to, almost anyone who will hear you out.
This is the interesting thing. So one of the things I would say, I'm going to circle back to that because I think that's a really important point. But one of the things that I've heard people say is, just a bit of online abuse, whatever. But I mean, you only have to go to the Turf as a Slur website to recognize this has been going on for years, where people have been sent pictures of nooses. I remember when Sal Grover got sent pictures of these sorts of things when she started speaking out. It steps right back to even prior to that, even when women would speak about these issues. The years and years and years and years and years of social media hate and violence, if you will, in that kind of sense of the word, is just horrific. And to suggest that this is just a little bit of like harmless hyperbole when someone says, what was the follow your leader?
Yeah. Like, with a picture of Hitler with the gun. Yeah. Got
which is just absolutely horrific. And I find it has been troubling me for so long, just how we're treating women in this particular issue.
See, I can handle the slurs and the abuse and criticizing my appearance and even calling me an idiot or whatever. I can handle that. But what they've resorted to now is impersonating me online and going on to other people's profiles with my profile picture and my name. And they're going on to other people's things and saying racist and homophobic things to try and incite people to come back and attack me personally. So, every time you think that they've sunk low, they'll go and sink even lower. And that's actually quite dangerous, because what happens then is people are getting dated screenshots of these fake accounts saying horrific things that look like I'm saying them. And then they're sharing those.
Yeah, look, it's something that happens. I mean, I remember it happened to some of the people in Collective Shout when they did that exactly the same thing to those women who are speaking out about the sex industry, which I thought was just terrifying stuff realistically. But I see that there's people like yourself who, like, these sorts of comments will just flow off like a water off a duck's back, so to speak. But there are women who won't, and there are women who will take those taunts and those horrific things to heart, and then that'll silence them.
Oh, look,
I guess the real example of this, and the most horrific example of this, is that Islamic woman who was really having a go at the guy, the TikToker guy, who then got doxxed and then got serious threats that were sent to her and her children, and now she's pulled back completely. And that sort of impact of that is just horrific, realistically. And I'm not suggesting by any means that the far right don't do this towards people.
I've had it done to me by the far right. And this
Yeah,
is the
so
irony. I
yeah.
was doxxed by an actual Nazi and attacked and had my life ruined. And what's happened is that has left me undoxable. But the parallel between what he did and what these trans rights extremists are doing
Yeah,
is remarkable.
yeah,
They're exactly the same people.
yeah. And this is something that Judith and Alice actually make a point about, is these are actually usually far right tactics that are now being adopted by the left, if you will.
But we also know that the incel to trans activist pipeline is a real thing. And a lot of these, left-wing trans rights activists, 5 or 10 years ago would have been incels on the right. And it's because the political climate has changed and that they've gone over there for the cause. They're not left in any other way except for trans rights.
That's interesting. I don't know that. I didn't know that. But that'd be quite intriguing to sort of see that link, if you like.
I think it was at the LGBT Alliance conference. It was really good.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the LGBT Alliance and some of the, so I do have hope and optimism in actual ways, in that it hasn't necessarily stifled public debate as much as maybe what the TRAs want them to. We still have on International Women's Day the kind of the conferences that I recently Judith and Alice presented at over in the UK, and Joe Phoenix. We still have your channel here, which I think is brilliant in having this, in being able to at least give women a voice to sort of talk about stuff that actually means something to them.
For now, it's being mass recorded. Yeah.
Oh, look, if they shut your channel down, man, they should shut half of YouTube down. Some of the stuff is on here, but you've got journalists like Barnes coming out with books. We've got Helen Joyce, who wrote a really wonderful, excellent book, actually.
And Bernard Lane, Clarissa Bai, there's some great journalists here in Australia.
Absolutely amazing stuff. And I can't remember the name of the woman that wrote the book about testosterone off the top of my head now. The US, she wrote an absolutely amazing book on testosterone. I really encourage anyone to read it. Just an absolutely fascinating discussion about what testosterone actually does and how important it is as a hormone, right? And the impacts that it has on the human body is quite significant. And so, yeah, I think that I have some hope that it's starting to turn a corner and people are starting to recognize that not only in this issue, but in other issues as well, that it's kind of important to have nuance and discussion and not just throw one-liners at people and then go ad hom and then call themselves bigots or whatever, call them bigots or whatever it is at the end of the day.
Well, it looks like, sorry?
No, go for it.
It looks like self-ID will pass in Queensland in May. And you may notice that the tiny minority is no longer a tiny minority. And the media will bombard Queenslanders with news articles featuring children and families saying, oh, now our child can be who they always should have been because their birth certificate's been changed to represent the sex that they are not. So yeah, it's like a little formula that seems to be rolling out state after state after state, and so far Queensland, Queensland's one of the last states to fall. So it's going to be interesting for Queenslanders to see it follow the same formula as all the other states, I guess.
So this is a really interesting thing that we could talk about really quickly. Recently, there was a fairly prominent academic within these circles saying, I don't understand why TERFs in this country can't get as much traction as they do in, say, the UK, and started to kind of justify these sorts of things, make claims that TERFs hate Indigenous people as well, or don't support Indigenous people as well, which is absolutely nonsense. But one of the things I would say about Queensland is that there is little to bugger all reporting on that act being changed. And if I went down the street tomorrow, and admittedly I live in regional Queensland, so it's a different scenario, but if I went down the street tomorrow and I took a survey of 100 or so people, I bet you they won't know that that's actually happening.
Yeah.
And it's because they've kind of kept it quiet and no one's reporting on it, which is quite remarkable to me. or maybe Sky News is reporting. I don't really watch Sky News, to be honest with you, but
I
maybe
don't
maybe they're reporting it. I don't know.
know.
But the reality is that the ABC is not reporting on it. I never hear anything about it on ABC, and I watch ABC a lot and listen to ABC News Radio a lot. Definitely don't hear anything about it on the commercial television stations, and it's just going to pass through because no one seems to know what's happening.
Yeah, and even here in Victoria, where it passed, you know, quite a few years ago now, people don't believe me when I say, no, that's every space, that's rape crisis, that's prisons. They go, no, it can't be possible.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So I think that if it passes, it'll pass by without much people knowing, and then if it actually starts to appear as a, I mean, let's be honest with you, Queensland is a two-tiered place. There's the southeast corner of Queensland, and then there's the rest of Queensland. And the southeast corner of Queensland is still slightly conservative, but not really. But the rest of Queensland is pretty conservative, right? And especially regional and rural Queensland. And the minute that stuff starts spreading out into the rest of Queensland, you are going to start seeing backlash against that, I think.
Yeah. It's the same here. Like, you know, out here, I'm in the outer suburbs, and none of that gender stuff out here. And if it is, it's like, oh yeah, good on you. You know, no one, like, you know, the kids are polite at school, but it really hasn't taken hold out in the regions. You know, there's a couple of kids identifying as non-binary, but none are on medication or anything like that. It's completely different to, you know, 40 k's into the city, and it's everywhere.
Right. See, I would have thought that would have been the case in regional Victoria for sure, but then we had the situation with the councillor at La Trobe Shire Council,
Yeah.
Latrobe Regional Council, I can't remember, who said something really innocuous. It was not even that, you know, it wasn't absolutely astounding or anything, just making a question, and now is kind of facing all sorts of retribution.
But it's because of that small vocal minority of these queer groups who target councils, you know, they kind of work, they focus on regional areas, and like Ballarat, for example, has a very militant trans rights activist impacting the council there. You know, they've got the same down in Gippsland, where I grew up. But, you know, people on the street who voted for that woman, they're going to support her views.
Yeah, I would hope so. I really do. And Gippsland is definitely not a liberal place. Like it's a very conservative country down there. I mean, I lived there for 4 years. I lived in Sale. The people there, I mean, the National Party has held that seat for God knows how long now, but it's a really long. Yeah, so they're not gonna change their opinions about sorts of things like this anytime soon.
But it's attacked from within. Every time a woman speaks up about women's rights, they're not attacked by the community. They're attacked by people within the organisation. Like, she's being attacked by other councillors to try and remove her. Just the way that Moira Deeming was attacked by fellow Liberal Party members to try and remove her, because they recognise a threat and they just want to stomp it out.
Yeah, and Louise Elliott too, right? Like
Louise too.
Councillor.
So the people who voted her in, they don't even get a say. They're not listening to the people, because the people voted people like Moira Deeming and Louise in, knowing full well their stand on this gender issue.
Yeah.
So when they're censoring these women, it's a kick in the face to the people who voted for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, actually, when I think about it from that perspective. I haven't actually thought about that before. You're really disrupting representative democracy then, in some respects, because these people voted these people in to represent their constituency, and then you're basically turning around and said, no, you don't align with our values, so we're kicking you out.
Well, that's what Dan did too.
Maybe you should probably go and have a chat to the constituency and see if they kind of support her still or not. And it's mostly women. I don't remember the last time a man's ever gotten in trouble with this sort of stuff before.
Well, we'll see after this airs.
No. Yeah, well, you know, like, this is the interesting thing about this whole discussion and debate. I mean, I guess again, I have my views. I have real concerns about the medicalization of children, which sets them up for a long medical intervention, and it's not like it just happens once and then it's over, right? Like the testimonies that I've heard, especially of detransitioners and stuff, the things that I've heard is just so horrific. And I'm just like, man, surely we can just put a pause on this and have a discussion and just say, wait for some proper evidence. I think that was really interesting about Barnes's book, right? About how she sort of said that no one stopped to think. They just went for it with the puberty blockers. And that worries me a little bit. I do think that women's sport in particular needs to be protected. I don't think that you can deny that biology has a major role there. I was a swimmer once upon a time, state swimmer at one point when I was younger. And yeah, I mean, just watching Leah Thomas dominate those women in the pool like that just made me think, surely at some point common sense has to intervene there, right? And we have to say, okay, we need to probably protect that sex-based class when it comes to sport. I don't know if that's controversial to say.
No, you have quite mainstream views. Like, you know, in the past we've had conversations and you've used preferred pronouns, and I'm wincing. But you know, you're a reasonable guy. And the irony is that the trans rights activists that I speak to, because I have them come over to my inbox to abuse me, and we end up having a civil conversation, much to their horror. And even some of the most militant trans rights activists that I speak to, those that work at ACON, have said to me off the record, I don't think children should be allowed to medically transition. And, you know, and most people, if they are presented with the facts about this, about gender, you know, about surgery and about the use of puberty blockers and the effect of cross-sex hormones, 99% of people will agree that it is potentially harmful for children to have those things.
Right.
And, you know, but the way the conversation has gone now, that even a reasonable view like that is considered transphobic.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. I'd be surprised to hear that. I mean, the evidence, as far as I understand, was so unclear as to whether or not puberty blockers were reversible, that I'd be very surprised to hear that any doctor. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that. There's probably a lot of doctors out there who think it's great because they don't have time to research this stuff, really.
Oh, they just refer to gender clinics now because of their conversion laws. They just go, ooh, I don't want to risk losing my license. So they just refer them to affirmation only gender clinics. So doctors aren't even allowed to look at them holistically anymore. It's straight, quick, I've got to refer.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? It's a strange time we live in. And I guess for me, I mean, there's so many other things going on in the world that I really care about, that I don't spend my, and I know you don't either, and I know a lot of people don't spend my days agonizing over this stuff. The thing that really pissed me off, though, and if I can be so honest with you, about trans rights activists is when they started using the term genocide. Now, that's when I got my back up really badly. And it's not genocide under international law unless they consider themselves to be religion. And if that's the case, then we're in a different ballpark, right? But when you use terms, words have meaning. And when you use horrific terms like that, you delegitimize the suffering of so many people around the world in history who are still suffering from it today. But the experiences of people who are experiencing genocide today, and this is where I will get cranky, and I will tell them that they need to stop using that term and to shut the hell up about it, because you've got Rohingya people who I talk to all the time sitting in Bangladesh camps on $10 a week, who are separated from their homeland and have been for some time, who experienced the most horrific genocide that we've seen in the region since Cambodia and since Indonesia and various other places. We've got an ongoing genocide that people are suddenly now denying, that the Chinese government, the CCP, is actually performing in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. And I've been advocating with my colleagues about this for years. No one really wants to touch it. And it just pisses me off that all of a sudden they're starting to colonize the use of the word genocide. Like,
with no evidence.
No, exactly. And you delegitimize people's real experience of genocide then, and who the ongoing sufferings that they experience on an ongoing level. So I will do a John McWhorter who is a really interesting guy from the United States who does stuff around critical race theory, and say most people need to stop using that term and sit down. And I and I will say that. And I don't mind having a discussion around rights, but if you start throwing hyperbole at me like genocide, I will get cranky. Mostly because, you know, my mum's home country is under civil war right now, and this is the other thing that gets me cranky too, is it's constant like trying to suppress people's speech, but also suppress people's opinions and ideas. We live in a pluralistic democracy, which is arguably so amazing, but we're killing it through this sort of language. And you know, my grandmother didn't escape a horrific regime for me to kind of just sit back and let my rights and freedoms to speak be taken from me.
Mine either, Nick, mine either. Yeah. My grandmother was the only one of her family to survive the Holocaust. So she got out of Austria when the Germans rolled in 1938. The only reason that she was able to get out was because she had trained as a nurse. Now, when she emigrated to Australia in the 50s, she had a German accent, and people used to call her a Nazi, which the irony of that, because, you know, Aussies back then couldn't tell make the distinction between an Austrian accent and a German accent. So, you know, so the irony of Nan being, you know, yelled at by idiots, you know, standing outside the milk bar, and I'm now being yelled at by idiots online, you know, the irony isn't lost on me. And, you know, and it was growing up in a family that heard the stories, the horrific stories that made me the way that I am, you know, made me someone who will stand up and say, no, that's not right.
No, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the fact that it's come full circle like that for you.
Yeah.
I wonder
what my nan would make of it. Like, you know, I really wonder what she'd make of it all. She's been dead for years, but, you know, and even my parents, like, I think they've always thought I was a bit weird because, you know, I was a vegan and a lefty and a, you know, politically, like, Dad was a unionist. So, you know, they were just normal working class people. And I was the first in my family to get a university education. So, you know, it was a big deal. And, but I think that they would be astonished that I'm just here, you know, standing up for women's basic human rights. You know, it's scary. Like how, like, you know, we were meant to be at a position where we could advocate for women overseas. You know, women in disadvantaged countries like Afghanistan and things like that. And we are so distracted about having our spaces ripped away from us in our own country that our resources and our energies are spent here instead of helping those women. So this is a worldwide problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. I mean, we've got, and Judith Swisser makes this point in one of the recent talks that she gave. It's like, why are we constantly having, it's a waste of time that we have to keep constantly defending ourselves and saying this is not what we mean. And it's bloody exhausting. She basically says over and over again, and it's stupid too. It's clear that we're not Nazis. It's clear that we're not fascists, and yet
that's what the gift Kelly J. Yeah, that's what Kelly J gave me, the gift of just saying, just stuff them. Who cares what they think?
Yeah.
Because I spent weeks and weeks and weeks, you know, because they said, oh, you haven't denounced them, so I denounced them. You know, you didn't tell them to go away. Oh, yes, I did. You know, I kept sort of trying to convince people that what they were saying was untrue. But then no matter what I did, no matter how low I groveled, they would never accept it because they have this thing in their head that to legitimize their abuse of me, they have to believe I'm a Nazi. They're not going to suddenly drop that perception because they've been presented with facts. You know, if you can hear a noise in the background, that's my goat. Can hear my voice banging on the door. So that is a sign that if I don't go and tend to the goat, she's going to smash through that double glazing. But she can hear my voice, and she's like, "Oh, I'm going to get in there, and maybe I'll get an apple." So,
Oh, an apple.
It's not even my goat. It's a lone goat. And I can see why her owner has left her here, because she's a very naughty thing. But she thinks she's a dog and she'd like to come in and sit on this couch, but it's not happening.
She probably thinks
Wow.
she's human, actually, because all dogs think.
Yeah, well, yeah, good luck to any cheap, random TRAs that come up to my house with dogs and goats and God knows what. We'll meet them halfway. So it could be interesting.
Cool.
Yeah. But thank you so much for coming on our channel. It's I think there's a lot of people out there in positions like yours who would like to speak out about this issue, and they felt afraid. So I hope that they see that you've been willing to talk and feel emboldened. And I really believe that the more people that speak out, the more other people will feel safe speaking up.
Yeah, I hope that. I do hope that within the space of academia in particular, that more academics will take the responsibility of academic freedom more seriously as well.
Yeah.
In that we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. And I think one of the biggest responsibilities that we have is to ensure that we have space to be able to have discussions around some uncomfortable things at times, and B, that every scholar who's doing a scholarship that delves into issues of finding truth ought to be protected. And I would stand up happily if this was happening, if what was happening to Holly was happening to a trans rights academic. They were getting hounded, stickers put everywhere. Certainly I'd be standing up for them as well and saying this is just nonsense. We're going to stop.
I've actually stood up for trans rights activists, trans identifying men on social media who also get hounded for speaking out and having gender critical views. The ones that do speak up and say, no, I don't think children should be medicalised. There's a few academics overseas that are trans identifying, and I'm happy to stand up for them.
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, it's just the nature of how it is, right? And I think that what I think is most damning about all of this is that when trans rights activists organise their soirees and their protest events and so forth, there's no women there throwing stuff at them and pegging stuff at them and threatening to beat them up or anything like that. But yet when women come together, not to protest, just to have a discussion and let their voices be heard, then you get what we saw in Melbourne, and then we get what we saw in Auckland, which was even more horrific. So I think that's a telling moment where we have to ask questions about, okay, have we gone a bit wrong? I think we have, absolutely.
Wow, that's a great point to leave us on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No worries.
I hope there's not too bad a pushback for you. I'm sure you can handle it if there is.
Fine, it'll be okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And if you could like, subscribe, and share, that would be fantastic. You can also support us on Patreon. The link's on my Twitter bio. And thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again next week.